Welcome back, everyone, to the Confessions of the Elderly channel. When my mother-in-law learned I was carrying a girl, she kicked me out to my parents' house. My husband and I stayed silent and did not argue. When I gave birth to a son, she wanted to see her grandson. My husband immediately said one sentence that made her leave in humiliation. I used to think the day I found out I was pregnant would be the happiest day after 3 years of humiliating life as a daughter-in-law. When the test showed 2 red lines, my hands shook so much I almost dropped it on the bathroom floor. I stood still for a long time, feeling a mix of joy, fear, and self-pity. Happy that we were finally having a child, but fearful because I knew that in that house, an unborn baby could be measured by notions of sons, daughters, and carrying on the family line. My name is Hong. 3 years ago, I married Duck, a kind, responsible man who loved his wife. If it had just been the two of us, my life would likely have been much easier. But I became a daughter-in-law in Mrs. Tham's house. My mother-in-law is a woman known in the neighborhood for being meticulous and traditional, but in reality, she is bitter and controlling. From the first day I stepped into my husband's house, I understood I wasn't seen as family but as a maid who had to learn to live to please her. I cooked the soup a bit bland. She said girls these days are clumsy. I hung the laundry in the wrong direction of the sun. She said I didn't know how to manage a household. I came home from work 10 minutes late. She hinted that a married woman should stop running around the streets. Once, I just accidentally left my sandals crooked on the porch. She called me back to the middle of the yard to scold me. A daughter-in-law must know her place. Don't think that just because you've entered this house, you become the lady of the house. It wasn't that Duck didn't know. Many times he pulled his mother aside and softly advised her to be less harsh with me. But every time, Mrs. Tham brushed him off, even crying as if I were the one bullying her. She said, "You married a wife and forgot your mother. She's only been here a few years and already has you wrapped around her finger." Every time I heard that, I just lowered my head in silence. I felt for Duck, being caught between his mother and his wife, so I endured many things, telling myself to just live kindly and one day she would understand. The day I broke the news that I was pregnant, Duck was so happy his eyes turned red. He hugged me so gently, as if afraid that a little too much pressure would hurt me and the baby. He kept looking down at my belly and smiling foolishly. So, I'm really going to be a dad, aren't I? Seeing him like that, my heart softened. I thought as long as my husband loved me, I could endure any other bitterness. At first, Mrs. Tham was very happy too. She went all around the neighborhood bragging that her daughter-in-law was pregnant, never forgetting to emphasize that our family would soon have a firstborn grandson. From that day on, she made me abstain from everything, not letting me eat this, go there, or bend over to sweep the yard. But strangely, I didn't feel any love in that care. It felt like she was preserving a precious object. Not out of love for the object, but out of fear of damaging what she was waiting for. Once, I craved a bowl of crab noodle soup from the end of the alley. She scolded me immediately. "You eat nonsense and affect the family lineage. Can you handle the consequences?" I felt choked up hearing that. The baby in my womb hadn't even fully formed, yet it was already being called this family's lineage, as if it only belonged to the paternal side, and I was just the one carrying the burden. Then, that afternoon, Duck and I returned from our ultrasound. The doctor said the pregnancy was developing well and the heartbeat was good, but the image suggested a high chance of a girl. I paused for a moment, not because of disappointment, but because my mother-in-law's face suddenly flashed in my mind. Duck seemed to understand what I was thinking. He held my hand tightly right in front of the clinic. He smiled and said firmly, "Any child is our child. Hong, as long as you and the baby are safe, that's all I need." Hearing that, my eyes stung. I told myself, luckily my husband isn't like his mother. Luckily, in this house full of prejudice, I still have someone on my side. But I didn't expect the real storm to begin right at dinner that evening. Mrs. Tham held the ultrasound report, initially eager to ask what the doctor said. But when she heard Duck calmly say there was a high chance it was a girl, her expression changed instantly. The smile on her lips vanished completely. She looked me up and down, her eyes turning cold as if I had just committed some terrible crime. The meal, once peaceful, suddenly grew as heavy as lead. She slammed her bowl onto the table. The sound of porcelain hitting wood was harsh and dry. Then she asked, each word hissed through her teeth, "A girl? Did this family spend 3 years raising a daughter-in-law just to bear a girl?" I froze, my throat tight and choked. Duck immediately set his chopsticks down, his voice low but clear. "Mother, what's wrong with a girl? She is my child." But Mrs. Tham wouldn't listen. She whipped her head toward me, eyes blazing. "What kind of person are you, failing to uphold the fortune of this family. A woman who marries and cannot bear a son has no face left to sit at her husband's table. I trembled, one hand instinctively moving to my belly. The baby was still so tiny, yet it had to endure these first bitter words from its own grandmother. Just then, the sound of shuffling slippers echoed from the gate. Neighbor Mrs. Bailu walked in, holding a basket of vegetables, smiling, but her eyes darted around the house. Sensing the tension, she didn't leave. Instead, she stopped, asked a few questions, and quickly grasped the situation. She clicked her tongue, her voice syrupy sweet, but each word was like pouring oil on the fire. I'm just being honest, a daughter-in-law is an outsider sooner or later, without a grandson, who will inherit the house and ancestral rights. Mrs. Tham, you must plan early, or being soft-hearted will only hurt you. That statement sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Mrs. Tham. Her eyes, already angry, now turned even more venomous, as if someone had just voiced her deepest fear. Duck clenched his hands into fists, while I sat silently at the table, hearing my heart pounding heavily. I knew from that moment on, the pregnancy within me was no longer a joy in my mother-in-law's eyes. It had become the excuse for her to push me out of this house. After that day, the house remained the same, meals were served on time, and the sound of my mother-in-law's broom still echoed every morning, but everything in my eyes had completely changed. Before, even when Mrs. Tham was critical, I consoled myself that mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law living together inevitably clash, and if I just endured a little, time would smooth things over. But ever since she learned my baby might be a girl, her displeasure was no longer hidden in veiled remarks. It was evident in every look, every sigh, and every time she slammed a bowl down during a meal. The most bitter part is that in front of Duck, she still acts like a mother-in-law who cares for her daughter-in-law. Whenever she sees Duck at home, she brings me soup, reminds me to drink milk, and tells me to walk carefully. But as soon as Duck rolls his bike out the gate, her tone changes instantly. Once, I was washing some cups in the kitchen. She stood behind me and said slowly, "People say a blessed woman bears a firstborn son. Otherwise, she suffers her whole life and brings misery to her in-laws." I froze, the faucet water still running, while my throat tightened. I turned around and tried to speak as softly as I could. "Mother, any child is your grandchild." Mrs. Tham gave a cold smile, thin as a blade. "Grandchildren aren't all the same. A daughter grows up and gets married. She carries the incense urn for someone else's family, not this one." With that, she walked away, leaving me standing alone in the cold kitchen, my hand on my belly, feeling a heartache for my child. My baby hadn't even been born yet, but was already being discriminated against and treated as a burden by her own grandmother. From that day on, Mrs. Bailu came to my house more often. She lives right next door and is famous in the neighborhood for knowing everyone's business and turning things that haven't even happened into tall tales. At first, she pretended to bring vegetables, bananas, or soup to check on me, but I knew she wasn't interested in my health. She was waiting to see what gossip she could take to the street corner. One afternoon, I was lying in my room and heard Mrs. Bay on the porch. Her voice was lowered, but still clear enough for me to hear. "Mrs. Tham? I'm telling you, don't be too soft. If a daughter-in-law has a girl, she'll just take the child back to her parents' house. She won't care about our family. You must secure the house and land now, or you'll lose everything you have." Mrs. Tham was silent for a moment and then sighed. "I think so too, but Duck is so protective of his wife." Mrs. Bay clicked her tongue immediately. "It's normal for a son to be infatuated with his wife. A mother must be alert and not let her daughter-in-law laugh behind her back." Those words felt like buckets of dirty water thrown into my heart. I lay on the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. I remembered the day I got married. Mrs. Tham held my hand in front of both families and said that from now on I was a daughter in this house. Yet now, just because the baby in my belly might be a girl, I have become an outsider and a threat to be guarded against. That afternoon, I saw Mrs. Tham pull an old iron box out of the closet. Inside were the land titles, property deeds, some savings books, and a stack of papers wrapped in a plastic bag. She sat right in the middle of the living room, carefully checking each paper before locking it with a new padlock. Seeing me standing at the door, she looked up, her gaze icy. "What are you looking at? This family's belongings must be kept carefully. People's hearts are hard to guess these days." I understood who she was talking about, but I still silently lowered my head and went into the kitchen. I didn't want to argue, and even less did I want Duck to come home and find his mother and me in conflict. But my silence didn't make things any better, it only made Mrs. Tham think I was afraid. That night, as I took the clothes out to the yard to dry, I accidentally heard her talking to Thou, Duke's younger sister. Thou had just returned from work, her voice still sharp. "Mom, did you hide all the documents? Let me tell you something, Mom." Heen looks gentle, but women become dangerous once they have children. Who knows if she'll demand a share of the property for her daughter later on. Mrs. Tham replied immediately, "I know, once she gives birth, I'll figure something else out. I can't let her cling to this house forever." I stood behind the wall, my feet feeling as if they were nailed to the floor. The breeze in the yard blew past, making the tiny newborn shirts sway on the clothesline. I looked at them as tears welled up in my eyes. My child hasn't even been born yet, hasn't asked anyone for a meal, hasn't bothered anyone for a single day, yet they already view my baby as a burden, as an excuse to fight over property. I am not afraid of being poor, nor am I greedy for anything from my husband's family. What hurts me is that the dignity of my child and me is being weighed against a few land deeds. That night, Duck came home late. The moment he saw me sitting silently on the edge of the bed, he knew something was wrong. He sat down beside me and asked gently, "Did Mom say something to you again?" I tried to shake my head, but my tears kept falling. Finally, I told him everything, from the way Mrs. Bailu stirred things up, to his mother locking away the documents, and Thou's words in the yard. Duck sat in silence for a long time after hearing it. That silence didn't feel like avoidance, but rather like he was trying to swallow a great deal of pain. After a while, he took my hand, his voice raspy, and apologized. He had thought that if he just spoke gently, his mother would understand, but perhaps he was wrong. I looked at him, feeling both pity and self-pity, and asked, "What if one day Mom really kicks me out? What will you do?" Duck looked up at me. In his eyes at that moment, there was no longer his usual patience, but a decisiveness that left me both surprised and feeling protected. He said slowly, word by word, "If Mom kicks you out, it means she kicks me out too. Wherever my wife and child are, that is my home. If this house cannot hold you and our child, then there is no place for me here either." I burst into tears. Not because I was weak, but because after so many days of suffering, I finally knew I wasn't alone. But I also understood that the storm in this house had not truly begun. Since that night, I no longer dared to deceive myself that everything would be okay. There are cracks in a family that, if covered only by silence, may look intact from the outside, but inside, they have been rotting for a long time. I once thought that as long as my husband and I were united, no matter how bitter my mother-in-law was, she would eventually stop out of consideration for the grandchild in my womb. But I was wrong. Mrs. Tham not only didn't stop but waited for a moment when many people were around to turn my humiliation into a spectacle for the whole family to witness. It was the day of Duke's grandfather's death anniversary. My husband's family didn't prepare a huge feast, but some close relatives were there to join us. I had been up since early morning to help with the cooking, even though my belly was getting heavy and my back was aching. Duck told me to go rest, but I didn't want anyone saying I was acting entitled just because I was pregnant. I kept washing vegetables, slicing meat, and setting the table, just trying to avoid tasks that required bending for too long. Mrs. Tham saw it all but didn't say a single word of sympathy. On the contrary, she intentionally kept sending me back and forth. One moment she'd ask for more plates, then for the soup pot, then complain that I didn't set the table properly. A relative noticed and pulled my hand, whispering, "You're pregnant, dear. Sit down and let me do it." I had just thanked her and wasn't even seated yet when Mrs. Tham called out from behind, "Oh, please, she's only a few months along, she's not sick, why coddle her like that?" Back in my day, I was still carrying water and chopping wood right up until I gave birth. She said that "back in my day" line so many times, as if the hardships of the past were an excuse for women today to keep suffering. I just bowed my head and forced a smile, but my heart stung a bit remembering back when we were first married. In this very kitchen, she once bragged to relatives that I was obedient and did whatever I was told. I thought it was a compliment back then, but now I realize the thing she liked wasn't me, but how easily she could control me. At mealtime, everyone sat packed around the long table in the main room. Duck pulled out a chair for me next to him, while Mrs. Tham sat at the head of the table, looking as stern as if she were presiding over a family meeting. Mrs. Bailu wasn't a relative, but she was there under the excuse of coming over to help since the morning. Actually, she spent the whole time hovering on the porch, picking vegetables and eavesdropping, yet when it came time to eat, she sat down as naturally as if she were part of the family. The meal had only just begun when Mrs. Tham suddenly looked at me and let out a loud sigh. Quote, having a pregnant daughter-in-law doesn't exactly put my mind at ease. The whole table suddenly fell silent, and Uncle asked, why would you say that? Isn't having a grandchild something to be happy about? Mrs. Tham glanced at me, her tone bitter. It's happy, I suppose. But you know, this family is small. I just hope for a grandson to carry on the ancestral rights. She left her sentence hanging, but everyone understood. My face flushed hot. I looked down at my rice bowl, trying to swallow the greens, but they tasted as bitter as medicine. Duck placed his hand under the table and squeezed mine gently. I knew he was holding back. He didn't want the Memorial Day to turn into an argument, and I didn't want to make him lose face before our relatives. A great aunt sitting opposite me saw me pale and stepped in. Tham, in this day and age, boys and girls are the same. As long as the child is healthy and the birth goes well, that's a blessing. I looked up at her with gratitude, but Mrs. Tham immediately brushed it off. It's easy for you to say, your house has both a son and a daughter, so you don't understand. My family only has Duck as a son. If he doesn't have a son to continue the line, how will I face our ancestors later on? Mrs. Bailu immediately laughed loudly, interjecting as if she had been waiting. People say it's a modern age, but having a grandson still makes the family foundation firmer. A tree has roots, water has a source. A house without a male heir will have a very cold altar. That statement made several relatives look at each other awkwardly. Mrs. Tham, as if empowered, grew even colder in demeanor. I set my bowl down, my palms damp with sweat. I wanted to say that the child in my womb was not at fault. I wanted to say that no one has the right to consider a baby girl bad luck, but my throat tightened. I was only afraid that if I opened my mouth, tears would fall in front of everyone. And I didn't want them to see me that weak. Just when the atmosphere seemed heavy enough, Mrs. Tham suddenly dropped a sentence that made my whole body freeze. Quote, I've decided, starting tomorrow, go back to your mother's house to rest during your pregnancy. This house isn't convenient to take care of you. The chopstick in my hand dropped onto the tray, hitting the edge of the bowl with a hollow clatter. I looked at her, unable to believe she could say such a thing right in front of the relatives. Duck slowly set his chopsticks down, his voice dropping low, Mother, saying that is the same as kicking my wife out. Mrs. Tham did not avoid his gaze. She replied coldly, who's kicking anyone out? If she's pregnant with a girl, let her go back to her parents to be taken care of. This house has ancestral duties to tend to. We have no time to coddle her. It's quieter over there, and we won't have to be such an eyesore to each other. My heart sank as I listened. Those words, eyesore, pierced right through me. So, after all these years of being a daughter-in-law, all the meals I've cooked, and all the times I've bitten my tongue for peace, in her eyes, I am still just an annoyance. Duck stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the tile floor. He grabbed my hand. His palm was warm, but his voice was strangely cold. Quote, fine, if that's what Mother says, then we'll move back to my in-laws. The entire dining table went silent. Mrs. Tham probably didn't expect Duck to be serious. She curled her lip, trying to maintain her air of superiority. Quote, go if you want, just don't come crawling back in a few days. This house isn't a marketplace where you can just come and go as you please. I looked at Duck, my heart aching with both pain and fear. But he didn't answer his mother. He just helped me to my feet. Mrs. Bailu still wouldn't let it go. She sneered, calling out that a son would eventually return to his mother, and a woman wasn't worth holding on to anyway. Quote, he's defending his wife today, but he'll be homesick by tomorrow. Duck turned to look at her, his gaze so icy that Mrs. Bay's smile vanished instantly. But he didn't argue, he only whispered softly, enough for me to hear. Quote, some words don't need an immediate retort. Let time answer for them instead. I understood that my husband chose silence not because he was weak, nor because he feared his mother or the gossip of others. He was recording every word, every look, and every insult they threw at my child and me. And I also understood that from the moment Duck took my hand and left that table, the door to my husband's home was no longer a place to return to with patient submission. I don't remember how I walked from the living area into our room. My ears were ringing, and my palms were ice cold. Meanwhile, the baby in my womb moved slightly, as if to remind me that I was not alone. As soon as the bedroom door closed, my tears began to fall. Not with loud sobs, but with hot, silent tears that just kept sliding down my cheeks. I stood before the old wooden wardrobe, looking at each neatly folded outfit, suddenly feeling that my 3 years as a daughter-in-law were like a long dream, just jolted awake by someone. Back when we first married, I personally wiped down every shelf, straightened every bedsheet, and placed our wedding portrait on the wall opposite the window. Back then, I was naive enough to think that if I just cared for this room, cared for every meal and every routine in the house, then one day my mother-in-law would truly see me as her own. Yet today, all I received in return was the remark that since I'm carrying a girl, I should go back to my mother's house to be looked after. I opened my suitcase, packed a few maternity outfits, placed my hand on my belly, and felt a lump in my throat. Duck entered behind me and closed the door very softly. He didn't say anything right away, just took a tissue from the table and handed it to me. Seeing me about to bend down to grab a bag under the bed, he immediately held my shoulders back. Quote, "Let me do it, you stay right there." His voice wasn't loud, but it was so firm that I didn't dare to argue. He knelt down and pulled out the bag of newborn supplies himself. The tiny pale yellow outfits, the pair of mittens. The soft hat I bought last month was folded by him with great care. He didn't rush, nor did he seem flustered. The way he placed each item into the suitcase made my heart ache even more. It wasn't just packing luggage, it was as if he were gathering all the hopes that had been trampled on by his own mother. I watched him open the drawer, take all my prenatal checkup papers, insurance books, and identification documents, and put them into a separate folder. Then, he suddenly stood up and walked toward the wall where our wedding photo hung. That photo was taken on a day we were smiling brightly, with white flowers and warm yellow lights in the background. Duck quietly took it down. He brushed the light dust off the glass frame and faced the picture into the suitcase. Startled, I asked, "What are you doing? Is all of this necessary? After all, this is your home." Duck turned to look at me, his eyes red but not weak. He said slowly, "A house that cannot protect my wife and child is no longer a home." That one sentence was enough to make my heart shatter. Throughout the meal, I had tried hard not to cry in front of them. But when I heard my husband say those words, I could no longer hold back. Outside in the living room, there were still the sounds of dishes, Mrs. Bailu speaking loudly on purpose, and thou smirking as if watching a funny play. I heard Mrs. Tham call out, "Pack up quickly, don't act like you're so aggrieved. This house isn't lacking people." Duck zipped the suitcase shut, his hand gripping so tightly his veins stood out, but he still didn't open the door to argue. Perhaps he understood that for people intoxicated by their own bitterness, arguing only gives them more excuses to call you disrespectful. When we stepped out, everyone at the table turned to look. I lowered my head, one hand clutching my belly, the other holding onto Duke's arm. Mrs. Tham stood at the door with her arms crossed, her expression cold as ice. She looked at the suitcase in Duke's hand and curled her lip. Quote, "Are you really leaving? Good. If you give birth to a girl, just stay at your parents' house. It saves space in mine." That statement was like the final blow. I turned sharply, my lips trembling, but Duck squeezed my hand gently. He wouldn't let me speak. He just looked at his mother, his voice very soft but every word falling clearly. Quote, "Mother, remember today's words well." Mrs. Tham paused for a moment, perhaps because she had never heard Duck speak to her in such a tone, but then she tossed her head, "I'll remember. You remember too. Don't come back here with your wife begging for my favor in a few days." Duck didn't answer. He pulled the suitcase and helped me walk across the yard. I heard Mrs. Bailu clicking her tongue behind us. Quote, "See, when a woman is pampered by her husband, she climbs all over her in-laws immediately." Thou muttered a small but venomous comment. "Let's see how long she lasts at her mother's." I heard it all, and I remembered it all, but I didn't look back again. Because in that moment, I knew if I looked back, my heart would grow weak once more. The road from my in-laws' house to my mother's wasn't far, but that night it felt endless. Duck drove very slowly, occasionally glancing over to see if I was tired. I leaned my back against the seat, hand on my belly, my tears slowly drying on my face. Neither of us said a single word. That silence wasn't as heavy as the one at my husband's house. It felt more like the stillness after a wound so deep that the pain hasn't fully set in yet. When we arrived at my mother's, she opened the door and froze, looking at my suitcase and my deathly pale face. She understood immediately. She didn't press me with questions, just hurried to help me inside. Before I could say a word, Duck bowed his head before my mother. His voice was raspy as he said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I have let Hong suffer for far too long." My mother looked at him for a moment, her eyes filled with both anger and pity. Finally, she sighed, "I don't need your empty apologies, as long as you truly protect your wife. This house still has room for both of you." That night, after I laid down to rest, Duck went out to the porch to make a long phone call. I faintly heard him telling the company accountant to transfer all his personal documents, maternity insurance records, and paperwork related to the house we were buying to my mother's address. He also called the bank to adjust the automatic monthly transfer he had been sending to his mother. He kept the basic support payments, but cut off all the extra funds she had been using as a means of control. Near midnight, Duke's phone rang. I saw the name, Mrs. Tham, light up on the screen. He answered the call and set it to a very low speaker volume. Her shrill voice came from the other end. "You're getting bold, aren't you, Duck? Are you cutting off your mother's money because of your wife?" Duck was silent for a few seconds before replying. "From now on, my money goes to my wife and child first. I haven't forgotten my duty to provide for you, but I won't let you use that money to pressure my wife anymore." There was silence on the other end, followed by a few more insults from her before she hung up. Duck walked back into the room and sat down beside me. He held my hand. My palm was still cold. I looked at him, seeing clearly for the first time that the man beside me had truly crossed the line between blind filial piety and the responsibility of a husband. I knew the days ahead would certainly not be peaceful, but at least from that night on, I was no longer a daughter-in-law pushed away in silence. I am Duke's wife, the mother of the child in my womb, and for the first time, my husband chose to stand firmly by our side. During the days at my mother's house, my life was truly more peaceful, but to say my heart is at peace would not be true. Some wounds may no longer be loud, yet they still smolder like embers beneath the ashes. Each morning I wake up, I no longer hear Ms. Tham's complaints in the kitchen, no longer have to watch anyone's expression to please them. My mother cooks me a bowl of hot porridge, and Duck takes me to work, then tries to get home early. My mother's small house has suddenly become a place where I can breathe. But whenever night falls, as I rest my hand on my belly, I recall my mother-in-law's words when I left. "If it's a girl, you can just stay out there." In the past, my mother taught me that being a daughter-in-law didn't mean losing oneself, but I didn't fully understand. I kept thinking that forbearance was keeping happiness, and silence was keeping peace in the home. Until the moment I was pushed out of the place I had nurtured, I realized that some people do not view forbearance as kindness. They only see it as an opportunity to take another step onto one's self-respect. Duck takes much better care of me than he did before. In the morning, he wakes up early to buy unsweetened milk and prepares my supplements before heading to work. In the afternoon, even when tired, he still rubs my feet because I've been getting cramps lately. Some nights, my back hurts so much I can't even turn over. He barely sleeps at all. He never complains, just gently helps me sit up and says, "Hang in there a little longer, you have me here." What makes me love him most is that since the day we moved to my mother's, he has absolutely not mentioned anything about his family. He doesn't tell me how his mother calls to scold him, how thou sends messages of blame, or what Ms. Bailu in the neighborhood is gossiping about. He hides all those things from me, as if trying to block every toxic wind outside the door so my child and I can be at peace. But I know what it's like for a son caught between his own mother and his wife and child. Even if he chooses the right path, his heart cannot be at ease. One morning early in the 6th month, Duck took a half day off to take me for a follow-up exam. This time, we didn't go to the old clinic but to a larger hospital, just as my mother advised. She said the bigger the baby gets, the more careful the checkups need to be. Do not skimp on time, do not skimp on money. All mother needs is for you and the grandchild to be safe. I nodded. After everything that has passed, I also want to be certain that the baby is still healthy. The ultrasound room was quite crowded that day. I sat in the waiting area, looking at the pregnant women around me. Some were with their husbands, others with their mothers. All wore the same look of nervous anticipation. Duck sat beside me, holding my medical records, occasionally looking at me to ask softly, "Are you tired? Do you want some water?" I shook my head, but I felt warm inside. When it was my turn, the doctor, a middle-aged woman with a gentle voice, reviewed my old records and began the ultrasound. At first, everything went normally. The doctor said the heartbeat was good, amniotic fluid was stable, and development indicators were within a safe range. I had just exhaled in relief when I saw her look at the screen for a bit longer. She moved the probe slowly, observing closely, then asked, "Who told you too it was a girl last time?" I was a little surprised. I turned to look at Duck, and he froze as well. I replied, "Yes, the doctor at the old clinic said it was likely a girl, but the fetus was small then, and they said it was just a guess." The doctor smiled, her eyes still on the screen. "Yes, that's right. At that stage, images aren't always clear and predictions can be wrong, but it's quite clear now. The baby is developing well and it is very likely a boy." I lay still on the ultrasound table, my entire body feeling frozen. The words, "very likely a boy," echoed in my mind. It didn't feel like a burst of joy, but rather a heavy blow to the painful memories of the past. I thought of that dinner, of Mrs. Tham's contemptuous look, and of her saying that if I gave birth to a girl, I should stay out for good. As it turns out, just because of an uncertain ultrasound paper, they kicked me and my baby out of the house. And ironically, the child they chased away is the very grandson they had been longing for day and night. Duck, standing beside me, was also stunned for a few seconds. I thought he would be happy or at least relieved, knowing this truth might make his mother regret her actions. But he didn't smile. He just leaned down and took my hand, his own hand slightly trembling. As the doctor stepped out for me to clean up, Duck whispered, "Boy or girl, it makes no difference. What hurts me isn't knowing the baby is a boy now. What hurts is that my mother abandoned you both just because of an uncertain ultrasound result." I burst into tears right there on the hospital bed, not out of joy, nor out of triumph. I cried for my child. If you were a girl, you wouldn't deserve to be looked down upon. If you are a boy, you also shouldn't be the reason for adults to change their attitude. An unborn child, boy or girl, only deserves to be loved unconditionally. Yet adults use a child's gender to judge, to discard, and to calculate gains and losses. On the way home, Duck drove very slowly. I sat beside him, clutching the new file, my heart in turmoil. A while later, I asked if we should tell his mother. Duck was silent for a long time. The red light ahead cast a faint glow on his face, making him look even more weary. He replied, "Not yet." He didn't want his mother to come back just because she knew it was a grandson. I turned to look at him. He continued, his voice dropping, "If she truly loved her grandchild, she should have loved it from the start, boy or girl. By the time the baby is born, he wants her to see the consequences of her own prejudice. He doesn't need her to lose an argument. He needs her to understand where she was wrong." That statement left me speechless. I began to understand why Duck chose silence in so many moments. He didn't want to squabble, nor did he want to use the baby as a bargaining chip for retaliation. He was just waiting for a truth clear enough that she couldn't avoid it, blame others, or pretend she had never been cruel. That evening, I tucked the ultrasound results into a private drawer. Duck placed his hand on my belly and whispered to the baby, "Just be healthy, that's all that matters. Mom and Dad don't need you to prove anything to anyone." I looked at him, feeling both pained and relieved inside. Pain because I knew the day our child is born will surely bring another storm. But I also felt relieved knowing that this time, my child and I were no longer alone. The day my baby is born will also be the day my husband's family has to face the truth they threw away themselves. I thought that after we found out the baby might be a boy, we would be able to keep the secret for a while longer. Duck told me strictly that this wasn't about keeping secrets out of spite, let alone using it for revenge. He just wanted his mother to have time to reflect, to realize a child shouldn't be loved or hated based on gender, but life doesn't always go as planned. Some things you try so hard to keep hidden are the very things outsiders end up dragging into the light. That afternoon, as I was folding newborn clothes in a small room at my mother's house, Duke's phone kept lighting up. He was out in the yard fixing the drying rack for my mother. The buzzing of the drill drowned out the sound of the ringtone. I looked at the screen and saw Mrs. Tham's name popping up, call after call. Since we moved in with my mother, she rarely called me, and when she called Duck, it was usually just to reproach him. But that day, the unusually frantic calls gave me a sudden, uneasy feeling. Before I could call Duck, my own phone started vibrating. The words, "mother-in-law," appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long time before finally pressing answer. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds, just the sound of heavy breathing. Mrs. Tham's voice rang out, trembling, unlike any other day. Is it true? Is the baby in your womb really a boy?" I froze, my hand gripping the phone instinctively. The question was so sudden, but enough for me to realize she had heard something. I later found out that afternoon, Mrs. Tham went to the district hospital for joint pain medication and happened to run into a distant acquaintance who was a midwife. That person had previously assisted at the clinic where I went for my checkups. Seeing her, she warmly congratulated her, saying, "You're going to have a handsome grandson soon. I saw your daughter-in-law's records the other day. The baby is very healthy." Just that one careless sentence left Mrs. Tham standing there, frozen in the hospital hallway. She spent her whole life longing for a grandson, yet she was the very person who chased the child's mother out of the house. Before I could answer, she changed her tone on her own, as if in a single breath, she could put on an entirely different face. I knew it. This family's bloodline couldn't possibly produce a girl. The doctor must have been mistaken the other day. I knew it was a boy from the moment I saw your belly. A chill ran down my spine as I listened. It was the same woman, the same voice, yet all her previous vitriol was wiped clean by a simple, I knew it. I placed my hand on my belly, my heart twisting in pain. I remember clearly the night I dragged my suitcase out of my husband's house. She was the one standing at the door, saying if I gave birth to a girl, I could just stay at my parents' house forever. I remember the memorial dinner, the judgmental gazes of relatives, and the biting remarks from her about how a daughter-in-law is an outsider. Those events didn't happen in some distant past. Yet now, just by hearing the words, "It's a boy," Mrs. Tham could address me in a voice that was almost affectionate. I didn't want to argue, so I replied briefly, "The doctor is still monitoring the baby's progress." "Why are you asking, mother?" Mrs. Tham quickly replied, "I'm asking because I want to take care of you. What else? How can a pregnant woman stay at her parents' house? I'll come by tonight to bring you both home. My grandchild must be born properly at his father's house." Hearing that, I felt a lump form in my throat. It turns out, in her mind, I am still just the carrier of the grandchild she wants to reclaim. As for how I am doing or how I feel, she didn't ask a single question. That evening, true to her word, Mrs. Tham appeared at my mother's gate. She brought 2 clean black chickens, some boxes of bird's nest, prenatal milk, supplements, and even a bag of blue baby clothes. Following behind her was Thou, whose face looked reluctant but who still tried to act friendly. As soon as she stepped inside, Mrs. Tham flashed a wide smile, a smile that I could only perceive as fake. "I've come to bring my daughter-in-law and grandson home. I've cleaned the house and prepared the room all over again." My mother was pouring tea, and upon hearing that, she set the glass down hard on the table. The sound of the glass hitting the wood rang out sharply. She looked straight at Mrs. Tham, her voice not loud but sharp. "When you chased her away, you didn't call her your grandchild. When she clutched her belly and dragged her suitcase out of the house, did you ask where they would sleep?" Mrs. Tham paused slightly, her smile stiffening, but she quickly countered, "You're being too harsh." I was angry that day. I just said that, who would really abandon their own child or grandchild? I sat beside them, gripping the hem of my shirt tightly. I used to think that if only my mother-in-law would soften her tone, my heart might melt. But now that she is truly sitting before me, bringing gifts and sweet words, I only feel cold inside. Because I understand this concession doesn't come from compassion, but from the words, grandson. Just then, Duck walked in from the yard. He saw his mother looking at the pile of supplements on the table and fell silent for a few seconds. As soon as Mrs. Tham saw her son, she stood up, her voice softening. "Duck, I know you've been angry with me, but how can families stay mad at each other for long? Now that we know it's a grandson, bring Hong home so I can take proper care of her." Duck didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room, his gaze chillingly calm. He asked, "Do you remember the day you said if it was a girl, she should stay outside forever?" Mrs. Tham flushed and hurriedly waved her hand. "Oh, goodness, I was so angry that I just misspoke. You know me, my words are sharp but my heart isn't cruel." Duck looked at his mother for a long time and replied, "A slip of the tongue doesn't force a pregnant woman to drag her suitcase out in the middle of the night. A slip of the tongue doesn't force someone to move, change their medical records, and cut all ties to protect themselves." The whole room went dead silent. Thou stood nearby, intending to say something, but was stopped by Duke's look. Mrs. Tham began to cry, the same way she used to force Duck to soften his heart. She recounted the effort of raising her son, being widowed early, and relying on him for her entire life. Quote, "I suffered so much to raise you all these years. Now, are you going to treat your mother like a stranger because of your wife?" Duck did not argue. He gave a very slight nod and said something that made Mrs. Tham freeze completely. "I am learning from you, mother. How have you treated my wife? In the future, I will treat you exactly the same way. You once said that whoever is kicked out of the house shouldn't come back begging after a few days. Today, I would also like to repeat that what you have pushed away cannot be reclaimed just because you want it." Mrs. Tham's face turned pale. For the first time, I saw her unable to find a response. She looked at Duck as if he were a stranger. Perhaps it was then that she realized her son was no longer the child who only knew how to bow and obey her. But in her eyes, I still did not see any real remorse. I only saw regret, panic, and the fear of losing the grandson she had just realized she had pushed out the door herself. Duck bent down to pick up each bag of supplements she brought and placed them back on the porch. He didn't throw them or yell, but every movement was decisive. "Take these home, mother. My wife needs peace and tranquility. When you come here because you care for my wife as your daughter-in-law, and care for the baby as a human being, not just because he is the family's grandson, then we can talk again." With that, he closed the gate. Mrs. Tham stood in the yard, holding the bags, her face flushed with humiliation. Thou pulled her mother's hand to leave, but she still stared into the house as if she couldn't believe she had just been rejected by her own son. As for me, I sat inside, tears falling quietly. Not out of pity for her, but because for the first time after so many days of oppression, I saw someone speaking up for my child and me, saying the things I had swallowed for too long. After being flatly rejected by Duck closing the gate, I thought Mrs. Tham would keep quiet for a while. At the very least, a mother, after being rendered speechless by her son, should probably reflect on where she went wrong. But I was too naive about people who are used to using tears to manipulate others. When real tears no longer work, they will find a way to fabricate a greater pain to force people to soften their hearts. 2 days later, around 8 p.m., just as I finished my glass of pregnancy milk, Duke's phone rang. The caller was Thou. As soon as he picked up, Thou's sobbing erupted on the other end of the line. Quote, "Duck, Mom's been hospitalized. Her blood pressure is skyrocketing. The doctor says it's very dangerous. You need to come right now. Mom keeps calling out your name." Sitting beside him, my heart suddenly tightened. Even though Mrs. Tham has treated me poorly, hearing that an elderly person is hospitalized, I still couldn't remain completely indifferent. Duck was silent for a few seconds, then asked clearly, "Which hospital is Mom in? What did the doctor say her blood pressure reading was?" Thou paused, stammering, I'm so flustered, I don't remember. Just come over first, Mom is very weak." Hearing how Thou answered, I saw Duke's eyes turn cold. He didn't say anything more, just told me to put on a coat and take me along. I hesitated. "Maybe you should just go alone. I'm pregnant. If I go, she might get agitated." Duck held my hand, his voice low. "You are my wife. If this involves forcing you to return to the family home, I want you to hear and see it for yourself." On the way to the hospital, Duck drove very calmly. He wasn't panicked like a son hearing his mother was in critical condition, but he wasn't cold or indifferent either. He said one thing that I will remember forever. Quote, "In the past, whenever Mom had a headache or felt tired, I would drop everything and rush home. Perhaps that's why she thinks as long as she claims she's sick, I won't dare to refuse her anything." Listening to this, my heart felt heavy. It turns out this form of control didn't just start with me, it had been clinging to Duck long before I entered that family. When we arrived, Thou was already standing in front of the hospital room. Her eyes were red, but her lipstick was perfectly intact and her hair was neat. Not like someone who was just panicked over her mother's danger. Seeing me with him, Thou immediately scowled. "Why did you bring your belly here? My mother is sick. Don't come and make her even angrier." Duck didn't look at his sister, only asked where Mom was. Thou sullenly pushed open the door. Mrs. Tham lay on the hospital bed, an IV drip in her arm and a wet cloth on her forehead. The moment she saw Duck, she immediately closed her eyes and gasped, her voice weak. "Duck, have you arrived? I thought I would never see you again." If it were in the past, Track Duck would have rushed over to hold her hand. But that day, he just stood still by the bed, looking at the blood pressure monitor and the IV drip that had only just begun to flow. Mrs. Tham opened her eyes, and seeing he wasn't as rushed as usual, tears immediately welled up. Quote, "I am dying, and you are still angry with me? I only wish to see you bring your wife home before I close my eyes. The grandchild of this family cannot be born at your wife's parents' house. Right, my son?" She said the last sentence very softly, but it was sharp as a needle. I stood nearby, hand on my belly, suddenly feeling a bitter kind of irony. Even while lying in a hospital bed, what she mentioned wasn't my health, nor the baby's safety, but where her grandchild should be born to save her family's face. Duck pulled up a chair to sit, not asking his mother but turning to ring the nurse's bell. A moment later, the doctor on duty walked in. Duck politely asked about Mrs. Tham's condition. The doctor looked at us and said generally that the patient had slightly high blood pressure from excitement, was being monitored, and showed no dangerous signs. Duck asked for permission to step out into the hallway to speak privately. I stood in the room, hearing Mrs. Tham let out a weary sigh, and Thou glared at me as if she wanted to lay all the blame on me. A few minutes later, Duck returned with the test results in his hand. His face was completely devoid of any emotion. He placed the paper on the bedside table, his voice terrifyingly calm. Quote, "The doctor said you only had slightly high blood pressure, not enough to be hospitalized for days. You insisted on staying for observation. I'm asking you seriously, Have you acted enough? The room fell completely silent. Mrs. Tham opened her eyes, her expression changing in a flash, no longer looking as weak as before. She sat up, pointing at Duck. You say your mother is acting? I gave birth to you and raised you all these years. Now that I'm in the hospital, you still doubt me. Thou immediately chimed in. You are being too much. You really have forgotten your mother since getting a wife. Mother is this sick, and you're still defending her. Duck picked up the test paper and slammed it down onto the table. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to startle both Mrs. Tham and Thou. He said every word clearly. Mother, do you think faking an illness will make my wife come back? Do you think you can just use filial piety to make me bow down and let you do whatever you want? Mrs. Tham was shaking with anger. You are unfilial. Ever since you married her, you have changed completely. Duck gave a cold smile and turned to Thou. If you were kicked out of the house while pregnant and told your unborn child wasn't wanted, would you still call that person mother? Thou opened her mouth to argue but was left speechless. That question wasn't just for Thou. It cut like a knife straight through the hypocrisy in the room. Right at that moment, the curtain of the bed next to them stirred slightly. I only then noticed Mrs. Belu sitting in the corner of the room, having been silent like a bystander until now. Seeing the situation turning against them, she stood up, her tone still in her usual preachy style. Quote, Duck, I'm telling you the truth. A son living with his wife's family is a disgrace to his ancestors. Your mother is only doing this for the sake of the family line. Duck turned and looked her straight in the eyes. This time, his gaze showed no respect for her seniority. He replied very clearly, I live with my wife and child, not by what people say. And if the ancestors have spirits, they certainly wouldn't be happy to see their descendants use family duty as an excuse to kick a pregnant woman out of the house. Mrs. Belu's face turned beet red. The relatives of patients in the neighboring beds turned to look, some even shaking their heads. She sputtered a few words then grabbed her bag and left, still trying to say before heading out, I gave good advice, yet I'm treated like a villain. After she left, the room became even more heavily silent. Mrs. Tham sat on the bed, lips tightly pressed, eyes red with anger rather than regret. Duck looked at his mother one last time and said, Rest, mother. I will pay the hospital bills, but do not bring up bringing Hong to the paternal home in this way again. Next time, if you are truly sick, I will still take care of you. But if you use illness to pressure my wife, I won't come alone to listen to you cry anymore. Having said that, he helped me out of the room. I walked beside him, my heart both trembling and relieved. In the hospital corridor, the white light hitting Duke's face made him look like he had aged several years overnight. I know that confronting one's own mother is never easy, but I also know that if he gives in today, my child and I will be dragged back into her control. Quote, that evening, as Thou later told me, Mrs. Tham covered her face and wept for a long time in the hospital room. But I understood those tears were not the tears of a person who had truly awakened. She cried because, for the first time, she couldn't use illness, tears, or filial piety to force her son to do her bidding. Deep down, what she feared most at that moment was not losing the bond with her son, but losing the grandson she had just realized she no longer had the right to reach. After the incident at the hospital, I thought everything would calm down for a while. Mrs. Tham stopped calling incessantly like before. Thou also stopped sending nasty messages, but that silence didn't make me feel at ease. On the contrary, it felt like the calm before a heavy storm. There were nights I lay listening to the wind hitting the window, my hand on my belly, telling myself that as long as my baby was born safely, I could put all the previous pain behind me. But they say pregnant women don't just need good food and supplements, they also need peace of mind. And my heart hasn't truly been at peace since the day I was kicked out of my husband's home. Even though Duck is always by my side, and my mother takes care of every meal, those old words still echo in my head from time to time. If you give birth to a girl, you can just stay out there. This house is not convenient for care, and a paternal grandchild must be born at the paternal home. Those words are like invisible ropes, always tightening around my heart. That night, it was raining very hard. The sound of rain hitting the metal roof behind the house was deafening. Gusts of wind blew through the door cracks, making the curtains flutter wildly. I woke up to a sharp pain in my lower abdomen. At first, I thought it was just a normal contraction, as the doctor had warned a few days ago that as the baby grows, there would be occasional tightness. I tried lying on my side and breathing slowly, but the pain didn't subside. It surged in waves, getting stronger each time, as if some hand were squeezing my belly tightly. I called out softly, Duck, honey, and Duck, who was sleeping on a small bed next to me, immediately jumped up. The moment he looked at me, his expression changed. Where are you hurting? Does it hurt a lot? Before I could answer, I felt a warm sensation sliding down my legs. I looked down and felt ice cold. There was blood. Duck saw it at that same moment, and his face turned as pale as a sheet. He didn't even have time to put on a raincoat. He just hurriedly wrapped a towel around me and scooped me up. My mother heard the noise and ran out, trembling the moment she saw the blood. "Oh my God, Hong." Duck forced his voice to stay calm. "Mom, please get my prenatal records. I'm taking Hong to the hospital right now." Outside, the rain was pouring down in buckets. Duck carried me to the car, rain splashing across his face, while I was in so much pain I could only clutch his shoulders. On the way to the hospital, everything in front of me blurred. Streetlights stretched into long streaks across the water-streaked glass. Duck drove very fast, but his hands were visibly shaking. At one point, the car skidded slightly on the flooded road, nearly crashing into the median. He slammed on the brakes and immediately turned to me, his voice breaking. "Hong, look at me, don't fall asleep, do you hear? Don't close your eyes." I wanted to answer, to tell him I could still hear, but the pain welled up, and I could only let out a choked moan. I was taken straight into the emergency room. The sound of gurney wheels rolling on tile, nurses calling out, the doctor asking for gestational age and medical history. Everything merged into a chaotic blur of noise. I only caught a glimpse of Duck standing outside the door, his clothes soaked, his hands stained with my blood, his eyes bloodshot as if his soul had been drained away. The door closed, shutting him out. The doctor examined me quickly and said, "There are signs of premature labor. The pregnancy has been affected by prolonged stress and abnormal contractions, making it very dangerous." Hearing those words, I felt my heart sink. I wasn't afraid of the pain. I was only afraid for my baby. This child has been with me through so many bitter words and so many tearful nights. If anything happens to the baby, I don't know if I can ever stand up again. I don't know who notified them, but about half an hour later, Mrs. Tham and Thou rushed to the hospital. I heard faint, hurried footsteps in the hallway and Thou asking where the emergency room was. Duck was still standing outside the door at that moment, having not yet changed his clothes, his hair still dripping wet. As soon as Mrs. Tham saw the doctor come out, she rushed forward, not asking if I was conscious or in danger. The first thing she blurted out was, "Doctor, can you save my grandson?" That question tore through the last shred of Duke's composure. He spun around to look at his mother. His gaze at that moment made even Mrs. Tham take a step back. Duck growled every word, his voice hoarse. "The person in there is my wife, not a machine for you to give birth to a grandson." The hallway suddenly went deathly silent. Thou wanted to say something, but was too terrified and kept quiet. Just then, the doctor announced that an emergency surgery was needed to ensure the safety of both mother and child. Duck signed the papers quickly, his hand no longer shaking. Perhaps when fear reaches its extreme, people suddenly become calm in a heartbreaking way. As for Mrs. Tham, only now did she start to truly panic. She looked at the surgical consent form, then at the operating room door, her lips trembling. "Why is it so serious? She was fine just the other day." An older woman sitting nearby, likely the relative of another patient, having overheard fragments of the story, she shook her head and said loudly, "I heard this woman kicked out her pregnant daughter-in-law because she thought she was carrying a girl, right? Being that cruel to a daughter-in-law. Now she's getting her karma." The words weren't too loud, but they were enough to make everyone in the hallway turn and look. Mrs. Tham stood frozen in place. For the first time, there was nowhere for her pride to hide. During the hours I was in the operating room, Duck did not let his mother come near. He sat on the bench in the hallway, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. I could not see it, but later, my mother told me it was the first time she had seen Duck cry like a child. He kept muttering, "Please, save my wife and child. Please, both of them must survive." When the operating room door opened, the doctor stepped out first. Duck sprang up, his legs unsteady. The doctor took off his mask and said, "Both mother and baby are safe. The boy was born prematurely but has cried. He needs further monitoring in an incubator." Hearing this, Duck almost collapsed, having to lean against the wall to steady himself. Mrs. Tham, standing behind, burst into tears upon hearing the words "baby boy," but her crying choked off the moment Duck turned to look at her. The moment my child was born should have been a source of pure joy. But in the hallway that night, no one could manage a smile. Because everyone understood that this baby had nearly failed to enter the world safely. It wasn't just because of a sudden labor pain, but the months of his mother being pressured, shunned, and disrespected to the point of exhaustion. And perhaps it was from that very moment that Mrs. Tham began to grasp the true price of the words she had spoken. After the premature birth that night, my son had to stay in an incubator for several more days. The doctor said he could cry and had good reflexes, but since he arrived early, he needed careful monitoring. As for me, I lay in the recovery room, my body feeling drained of all strength, every turn stinging down to my bones. Duck hardly left the hospital for a single step. He ran back and forth between my room and the neonatal unit, his eyes always red from lack of sleep. During those days, Mrs. Tham came to the hospital a few times, but Duck would not let her visit the baby. He only allowed her to stand outside the glass door and look from a distance. She stood there for a long time, clutching her bag straps, eyes glued to the tiny incubator where my son lay. If it were before, I might have felt a change of heart. But I had just gone through a brush with death. And the first thing she asked the doctor that night still rang in my ears. "Will you be able to save the grandson?" A grandmother who truly loved her grandchild would have asked if my child and I were safe first. Yet, only a few days later, once my child was out of danger, Mrs. Tham changed completely. She didn't change out of remorse, but rather like someone who had just recovered something to boast about. She went all over the neighborhood announcing that she had a grandson and heir. Whenever she met anyone at the market, she smiled brightly. "It's a boy, over 2 kilograms, born premature but very strong. He really takes after our side of the family, no doubt." When someone asked how the daughter-in-law was doing, she just replied dismissively that I was fine. "Every woman goes through childbirth, it's nothing." When my mother heard this from acquaintances, she was so angry she laughed. She set the bowl of porridge down by my bed, shook her head and said, "When you were clutching your belly and dragging your suitcase here, she didn't even acknowledge it as her grandchild. Now that it's a boy, she's bragging all over the neighborhood as if it were her own achievement." I lay in bed looking at my still aching incision, feeling my heart grow cold bit by bit. I was no longer surprised, because after everything, I understood that for Mrs. Tham, the important thing was never me or the baby, but the title of being a grandmother to a grandson. One day, Mrs. Tham even deliberately went over to Mrs. Bailu's house. The neighbors said she stood in the yard speaking loudly. I knew right away that Ham's belly was carrying a precious son. The doctor must have been mistaken back then. There's no way a family like this wouldn't have a grandson. Mrs. Bailu, the one who once urged her to keep the house and land and said daughters-in-law were outsiders. At this moment, she changed her attitude as quickly as flipping a pancake. She laughed heartily. "I told you, your family is truly blessed to have a grandson. It's a sure thing now. From now on, you'll have plenty to be proud of." Those words reached Duke's ears. He didn't say anything, but I saw his jaw tighten. That evening, while sitting by my bed, he looked at our baby in a photo on his phone and whispered, "I thought that after that night in the operating room, Mom would be scared and come to her senses. It turns out Mom is only afraid of losing her grandson, not of losing her daughter-in-law." I didn't know how to respond. I just held his hand. Some of a man's sorrows are not noisy, but once they settle, they are very deep. A week later, while I was still resting at my mother's house, Mrs. Tham did something on her own that neither Duck nor I expected. She organized a full-month celebration for my child at the paternal home. Even though my baby wasn't even a month old yet, even though the doctor warned against contact with crowds, and even though my husband and I never agreed, she called relatives, invited neighbors, and ordered several large banquet tables. She even told everyone that on that day, she would bring her grandson home to officially present him to the ancestors. That morning, Duke's phone started ringing early. First Mrs. Tham called, then Thou texted, "Bring the baby home, the guests have arrived, Mom has prepared everything, don't make Mom lose face." Duck read the message with a straight face. As I held our child, hearing the persistent ringing, my heart was filled with anxiety. I asked quietly, "What are you planning to do?" Duck looked at me, his voice very calm. "I will go back alone. You and the baby stay here. The baby was born prematurely, no one has the right to parade him around to show off to the world." I nodded, but my heart was still pounding. I knew that when Duck returned to that house alone, there would surely be trouble, but I also understood that there were things he had to say himself in front of his mother and relatives so that later on, no one could use the family name to pressure me and the baby anymore. By noon, Mrs. Tham's courtyard was already crowded with people. The feast was laid out in a long row from the main room all the way to the porch. Cakes, sticky rice, sweet soup, and boiled chicken were all there. Mrs. Tham wore a new velvet outfit, a gold necklace around her neck, and her face was carefully made up. She kept looking toward the gate, both impatient and trying to keep a smile on her face. When someone asked where the grandchild was, she smiled awkwardly. "They're arriving soon, they're still preparing things for him, but we never appeared." She called Duke's phone repeatedly. At first, she was gentle, then she became irritable. When Duke's car stopped in front of the gate, the whole courtyard instantly buzzed with excitement. Mrs. Tham stood up hurriedly, a smile widening, but just a few seconds later, that smile froze. Duck got out of the car alone, carrying no baby in his arms, nor any baby bags. Mrs. Tham rushed out, her voice urgent. "Where is the baby? Where is Hong? Why did you come alone?" Duck looked at his mother and then scanned the courtyard full of relatives and neighbors. He didn't go inside. He stood right in the middle of the courtyard and said clearly that he came to address one thing. Mrs. Tham tried to smile, stepping forward to pull his arm. "Whatever it is, we'll talk later. Hurry and bring the baby in for everyone to hold. Everyone has been waiting since this morning." Duck pulled his hand away. He didn't raise his voice, but every word he dropped made the whole courtyard deathly silent. "My son will not come to the house that once chased his mother away while she was pregnant." The air froze. A few relatives looked at each other. Some put their chopsticks down. Mrs. Tham turned pale, her lips trembling. "Duck, what are you saying? Today is a happy day, don't make me lose face." A cousin frowned and asked, "Then what is this party for?" "My mother said that my wife and I agreed to bring our child here for the introduction." Duck turned to the man, respectful but firm. Quote, "Sir, my mother did this on her own. My wife and I never agreed to it. The baby was born premature. The doctor advised limiting contact. My wife is still in pain from her C-section, yet no one asked if she could handle this. Everyone was just waiting to hold a grandson." Mrs. Tham hurriedly pulled his arm again. This time, her voice was almost pleading. "Stop it, Duck, let's talk about this inside. Don't let people laugh at me." Duck looked at his mother, his eyes turning red, but his voice remained cold. "Is your reputation more important than my wife's life? The day Hong was in the operating room, you asked about your grandson first. Today, even though the baby isn't well, you've already paraded him out for guests. Do you love your grandchild, or just the title of being the grandmother of a firstborn grandson?" The whole yard went so quiet that you could hear the wind blowing through the sun tarps. Mrs. Bailu sat in the corner, her face changing colors, not daring to interfere as she usually did. Mrs. Tham stood frozen, her hands hanging limp at her sides. Duck bowed to the elders and then turned away. Not a word of scolding, not a superfluous sentence, yet that decisiveness hurt more than any shouting. Duke's car left the gate, leaving behind a feast no one had touched and the gossiping eyes now fixed on Mrs. Tham. As for her, the woman who once thought having a grandson could win back everything, for the first time, she was made to have nowhere to hide her face from the world by her own son. And perhaps from that moment on, she began to understand that a grandson is not a ticket to erase everything she had caused my mother and me. After the full-month celebration feast was left abandoned in the yard, Mrs. Tham's name became the talk of the entire neighborhood. She used to be someone who guarded her image very carefully. Even to the market, she wore crisp clothes and always spoke as if she came from a refined family. Yet, in just one afternoon, the things she had spent a lifetime trying to preserve suddenly shattered in front of her relatives. People no longer spoke of her as a strict mother-in-law but began whispering about what kind of strict she really was. Driving a pregnant daughter-in-law away, only to accept her once she saw a grandson. I heard from my mother that some people even brought it up right to her face. "You used to say if your daughter-in-law had a girl, she should stay at her parents' house, but now it turns out to be a boy. Do you regret it?" Mrs. Tham turned red and pale hearing that, but she didn't lash out like she used to. The most painful thing for someone used to looking down on others isn't being scolded, but having everyone see their mistake. As for Mrs. Bailu, who once added fuel to the fire, she turned her back the moment she saw Mrs. Tham being criticized. She told people at the market, "I was just making a suggestion." Nobody forced her to kick her daughter-in-law out. "Mrs. Tham has always been hot-tempered, don't blame it on me." Those words eventually reached Mrs. Tham's ears. I heard she stood silently in front of a vegetable stall for a long time that day, holding a bunch of bok choy and forgetting to pay. The woman who once trusted Mrs. Bay as an advisor, who took every word and dumped it on me, finally tasted what it was like to be cast aside. Perhaps for the first time, she found her large house dreadfully empty. Her son wouldn't come back, her daughter-in-law wouldn't return, and she couldn't hold her grandson. Duke's younger sister, Thou, only knew how to complain and go out with friends. Those who sat at the feast that day also avoided mentioning her family, but their looks were enough to show her how much she had lost face. As for me, after being discharged from the hospital, Duck took me to my mother's house for my postpartum recovery. My son was still so small, his skin bright red, his breathing as thin as a thread. Every time I held my son, I remembered the night in the operating room and Mrs. Tham's chilling question. Quote, "Did you manage to save the grandson?" Perhaps I will never forget that for as long as I live. I used to wish that she would love me just a little, just a little like an elder loves a child in the house. But when I was between life and death, I realized that affection based solely on a child's gender is no longer love. One morning when the air was still chilly, my mother was hanging milk cloths in the yard when there was a very soft call at the gate. It wasn't the shrill, demanding voice from before, nor the impatient, rhythmic knocking on the door. It was a voice so quiet that if you didn't pay attention, you would think it was just the wind blowing by. Quote, "My, could you please let me see Hong for a moment?" I was sitting in the room and froze the moment I heard that voice. It was Mrs. Tham. My mother went out to open the gate but didn't invite her in right away. I held my child and stood behind the curtain, looking out. Mrs. Tham looked completely different that day. No velvet shirt, no gold necklace, none of her familiar arrogance. She wore an old dark brown shirt, her hair was hastily tied, and her eyes were swollen from crying. In her hands, she clutched a small wooden box wrapped in a red cloth. She stood outside the gate, her posture hunched, lacking the overbearing manner that used to terrify me. She saw me, her lips trembling for a long time before she could speak. "Hong, I just want to see my grandchild for a moment." I did not respond. She opened the red cloth, revealing a small gold bracelet inside, the kind of plain ring for babies that people used to call a soul-keeping bracelet. She said tremblingly, "This is a family heirloom. Duke's grandmother left it for him when he was little. I want to put it on the baby." I looked at that bracelet, but my heart felt no joy. If this were back when I first married, I might have been touched, thinking I was finally accepted. But now, after so much bitterness, that bracelet didn't make me feel any warmth. It only made me remember the night I packed my suitcase and left my husband's home, when she stood at the door and said that if I gave birth to a girl, I could just stay away forever. One cannot use a gold bracelet to erase a wound that has bled to the bone. Before I could say anything, Duck stepped out from behind me. He had just returned from buying my medicine, still holding the pharmacy bag in his hand. Seeing his mother at the gate, he paused for a second, then walked straight to stand in front of me. He didn't shout, nor did he frown. It was that very calmness that made the atmosphere feel even heavier. Mrs. Tham looked at her son, her voice trembling. "I know I was wrong. Please let me hold my grandchild. I'll only hold the baby for a little while." Duck looked at the bracelet in her hand and asked very slowly, "Do you want to hold the baby? Or do you want to keep the reputation of having a grandson for the world to see?" Mrs. Tham was speechless, her hand holding the bracelet shaking. After a moment, she stammered, I really do love my grandchild." Duck looked straight into her eyes. "The day you chased my wife away, did you ever think about what would have happened if she had miscarried that night? The day you stood at the hospital asking the doctor if they could save your grandson? Did you remember that the person in the operating room was also my wife?" Quote, Mrs. Tham burst into tears, but this time her crying was not like before. No more screaming about unfilial sons, no more listing the efforts of raising Duck, and no more blaming me for changing her son. She choked on her sobs, her shoulders trembling. The gold bracelet in her hand fell softly into the wooden box. Mom was wrong. Back then, I was too blinded. I only thought of a grandson, thought of our relatives, thought of our family altar. I didn't think that Hong was also a human being. That sentence made my heart ache, not because I pitied her, but because of the pain. Pain because it took until now, after my child and I were almost in danger, for her to realize that I am also a human being. Duck still stood in front of me. He did not let his emotions soften him too quickly. He continued, each word very clear. "My son does not need a grandmother who only loves him because he is a boy. If the doctor had said that day that Hong really gave birth to a girl, would you be standing here?" Mrs. Tham bowed her head, unable to answer. That silence was the most cruel answer of all. Duck looked at his mother, his eyes red but his voice did not tremble. "Take the bracelet back, Mom. When you learn to love a child regardless of whether it is a boy or a girl, when you know how to apologize to Hong for what you did to her, only then will you deserve to meet my child." Mrs. Tham was stunned into silence. My mother stood by and was also silent, but I saw her eyes turn red. A few neighbors passing by stopped to look. Perhaps they caught a few words. Mrs. Tham held the wooden box to her chest, her face pale with shame. If it were before, she would have been furious, pointing her finger at me, accusing me of pulling Duck away from her. But that day she did not scold. She only nodded very slightly, tears falling onto her wrinkled hands. Then she turned away, her figure shrinking into the familiar alley, the gold bracelet box held tightly to her chest. I stood behind Duck, watching until her figure disappeared from sight. It was the first time I saw Mrs. Tham leave without hurling insults, making threats, or trying to recruit anyone to her side. She left in humiliation, but also in a silence that felt quite different. A silence like that of someone who has just begun to hear the voice of their own conscience. After the day Mrs. Tham left clutching her gold bracelet, our house remained quiet for a few days. I thought that silence was a sign that everyone was tired, sick of the constant tug of war, or at least knew my child and I needed to rest after surviving so much. But it turned out that when people cannot enter one's home through kindness, they find a way in through the gossip of others. And the one who stoked those flames was none other than Mrs. Bailu. In just a few days, the marketplace was buzzing with all sorts of rumors. At first, it was just casual chatter while buying vegetables or meat, but then it turned into detailed stories as if the speakers had seen it all themselves. Claims that I had known I was carrying a boy all along but hid it from my in-laws for revenge. That my mother encouraged me to keep the baby on her side so that eventually Duck would have to live with his wife's family. Some even said Duck was under a spell cast by his wife and mother-in-law, which was the only reason he dared to turn his back on his own mother. I heard these words from a neighbor who cared enough to stop by and tell me. She stood at the gate, hesitating for a long time before saying, "Hong, I'm telling you this so you can be prepared. People at the market are whispering fiercely. They say you were calculating, knowing it was a boy and trying to keep him all to yourself." I was holding my baby, and hearing that, my hands went cold. The little one in my arms was fast asleep, his innocent face unaware that he was being dragged into another round of adult scrutiny. I didn't cry anymore. Perhaps after so much hurt, even tears get tired. I just remembered my first days as a daughter-in-law, when this very Mrs. Bay used to come over for tea, smiling brightly and saying, "Mrs. Tham is so blessed to have such a gentle daughter-in-law." Yet now, that same mouth has turned me into a scheming woman who hides and steals a grandson from his father's family. It turns out that in this life, some people have no need for the truth, they just need a juicy enough story to gossip about. The rumors didn't just stay in the neighborhood, they reached Duke's workplace too. One afternoon when he came home, I saw his expression was gloomier than usual. He still washed his hands, changed his shirt, and went to hold our child, but I noticed a profound weariness in his eyes. I kept asking until he finally said, "At the company, people have been hinting, asking if it's true I abandoned my own mother to follow my wife's family. Some even made tasteless jokes that a man led by his wife would eventually lose his entire family name." Hearing that, I choked up. I said, "Why don't you just explain everything? I don't want you to be misunderstood because of me." Quote, Duck looked at me and shook his head, saying that talking to people who love rumors isn't enough. They need to hear the actual voice of the person who started them. That was when I learned that since back at his family home, Duck had quietly kept many audio recordings. There were clips of Mrs. Bailu calling me an outsider, parts where she urged Mrs. Tham to keep the house and land, and even messages from Thao complaining about how Mom used to listen to Mrs. Bay. I looked at him in surprise. Duck gave a sad smile, saying he never wanted to use them, but he learned something the day I was kicked out. If you don't keep evidence, the wrongdoer will always tell the story in a way that makes them the victim. That statement left me silent for a long time. I used to think he was patient because he was weak-willed. Only now do I understand that some silences aren't about giving in, but about waiting for the right moment to set things straight once and for all. That evening, Duck didn't tell me much, just that he would go over to Mrs. Bailu's house for a while. I worriedly told him not to get angry, lest they have an excuse to say he was disrespectful to his elders. Duck replied, "I'm not going there to shout. I'm going to put the truth back where it belongs." With that, he grabbed his phone and left. Mrs. Bay's house is right at the entrance of the alley, where a few people always sit drinking tea and gossiping. It was the same that day. As soon as Duck arrived, the others turned to look at Mrs. Bay, who was sitting there fanning herself. Seeing Duck, she hesitated for a moment but still gave a fake smile. "Oh, is that you, Duck? Coming over to visit, dear?" Duck stood right in front of the porch, his voice very calm. "I came over to ask you one thing. Did you tell everyone that my wife intentionally hid her pregnancy with a son to get back at my family?" Mrs. Bay immediately waved her hand. "Oh dear. It's just what people are saying. I don't know anything. What right do you have to talk about my family's business?" Duck didn't argue. He just opened his phone and played a recording. Mrs. Bay's voice rang out clearly across the yard. "A daughter-in-law is an outsider sooner or later. If there's no grandson, you have to secure the house and land starting now." As soon as the recording ended, the people sitting there drinking tea looked at each other. Mrs. Bay's face turned pale, and the fan in her hand froze. She stammered, I was just joking." Who knew Mrs. Tham would take it seriously? Besides, I was just concerned for her. I didn't mean any harm. Duck looked at her, his gaze turning cold. One joke of yours nearly cost my wife her life. Are you happy now? One joke made my mother kick her pregnant daughter-in-law out of the house, forcing the premature baby into an incubator. You still call that a joke? No one in the yard answered. An older man sitting next to the teapot let out a soft sigh. Bae, a loose tongue can really hurt people. If you don't know the truth about someone's family, don't add fuel to the fire. Mrs. Bae blushed and said weakly, I didn't force anyone. Mrs. Tham made her own decision. Just then, Mrs. Tham walked in from the gate. Perhaps she heard the noise and came over, or maybe she had just found out Duck was here. She stopped dead in her tracks when she heard Mrs. Bae washing her hands of all responsibility. The neighbor she once trusted, whose every word she listened to, was now immediately pushing all the blame onto her the moment the heat turned on herself. Mrs. Tham looked at Mrs. Bae, her lips trembling, but she couldn't speak. For the first time, I think she understood what it felt like to be pushed into a corner by other people's words. Duck turned to his mother, his voice not harsh but every word was very clear. Did you hear that, Mom? The person who incited you to do wrong now says it was just a joke, but the one who suffered was Hom, the one in the incubator was my child, and the one who lost a child, a grandchild, and face with relatives was you. Mrs. Tham bowed her head, her hands clutching each other. An elderly neighbor leaned on his cane and stood up, looking at Mrs. Tham as he said slowly, You didn't lose your grandchild because your daughter-in-law is cruel. You lost him because you listened to the neighbors more than your own son. That statement left Mrs. Tham stunned. No one took her side, and no one scolded her. But the silence of everyone there felt heavier than any reproach. That evening, hearing Duck recount it, I didn't feel triumphant. I only felt exhausted, and as for Mrs. Tham, after leaving Mrs. Bae's house, she returned to her large home and pulled all the gift bags she had prepared for her grandson out into the middle of the room. Scarves, clothes, silver bracelets, boxes of milk, toys, everything still had the price tags on. She sat among the pile of items for a long time, weeping alone. Perhaps for the first time, she realized these belated gifts could not make up for the time she turned her back on us when my child and I needed protection most. After that evening when Duck went to Mrs. Bae's house to clear everything up, I thought the biggest storm had passed. At the very least, Mrs. Tham had seen that outsiders were not as trustworthy as she had imagined, and the gossip in the neighborhood also gradually died down. I just wanted to focus on raising my son so he could grow stronger every day. But in a family that had grown accustomed to placing face above kinship, not everyone was willing to bow before the truth. The one who refused to accept it most was Thou. Thou was the youngest daughter in the house, spoiled by Mrs. Tham since she was little, so she had an impulsive temperament and always had to get her way. Back when I first married into the family, Thou once mocked me, if you're going to be a daughter-in-law here, just listen to my mother to keep things peaceful. My mother doesn't like anyone arguing back. Quote, at that time, I just thought she was immature and spoke without thinking. But later on, I understood that Thou was not only heartless but also harbored the same competitive nature as her mother. After the incident where Mrs. Tham was embarrassed by Duck in front of the neighbors, Thou hated me even more openly. She believed that if not for me, Duck would still be the brother who loved his mother, indulged his sister with monthly payments, and took care of everything for the holidays. But now, Duck puts his wife and child first, cuts back on the extra allowance, and doesn't let his family see the grandson whenever they please. To Thou, the fault doesn't lie with her mother's bitter words, but with me. A daughter-in-law who dares to make her husband take her side. One evening, just after I had put my child to sleep, my phone signaled a message from Thou. It had been a long time since she messaged me in such a kind tone. Hom, I know I've been out of line before, but I am the child's aunt after all. Could you let me come over and visit for a moment? I won't be a bother. I read those lines over and over, yet I felt no sense of relief in my heart. People can change, but true change never comes through a few suddenly sweet words. I replied very cautiously, the baby is still weak. The doctor advised limiting contact with others. When the baby is stronger, I will discuss it with Duck. Just seconds later, Thou messaged back, like a stranger. I am his aunt, and you call me a stranger? Aren't you afraid that if you do this, the child won't know his father's side when he grows up? I looked at the screen and sighed. So that initial gentleness was just a thin veil that tore at the slightest touch. Unable to reach me, Thou turned to blame Duck. She called him during work hours, her voice so harsh that even someone standing nearby could hear it clearly. You value your in-laws more than your own blood, right? You hide your own child like a treasure, not letting his grandmother see him or his aunt hold him. Aren't you afraid of getting a bad reputation later? Duck only replied briefly, I'm not hiding my child, I'm protecting him from those who use him as an excuse to win or lose. A few days later, I took my child for his scheduled follow-up appointment. Duck had an important meeting that day, so my mother went with me. The boy was better, but he was still small. Every time I go out, I bundle him up carefully, bringing enough milk, medicine, and paperwork. The hospital was packed in the morning. The sound of crying children, calling numbers, and wheels rolling back and forth left me a bit dizzy. My mother told me to sit and wait. She would hold him for a while so I could catch my breath. After the exam, the doctor told me to go to the counter to pick up the baby's blood test results. I looked at my child sleeping in my mother's arms, hesitating for a moment before I left. I never expected those few short minutes would make my heart almost stop. As I turned back into the hallway, I heard my mother shouting from afar, "Let go! Who gave you permission to take my grandchild?" Quote. I rushed over to see Thou grabbing the baby from my mother, while Mrs. Tham stood behind, pale but still reaching out. Thou yelled loudly in the hallway, "I am his aunt. Is it a crime to hold my own nephew for a moment?" Quote. You're being so possessive, Grandma. Are you trying to cut the father's side out of his life completely? Quote. My mother held the baby tight, her face flushed with anger because he was born prematurely. The doctor said he shouldn't be agitated. If you want to hold him, ask his mother, don't snatch him like you're at a market. The baby was startled by the shouting and started wailing. The cry was loud at first, then suddenly choked off. I watched my son's face turn pale, his lips slightly purple, his body curled up in the blanket. In that moment, my blood felt like it had frozen solid. I lunged to take him from my mother, calling his name in a panic. My baby, look at mommy, please. Thou froze in shock but still stammered. I just wanted to hold him. A nearby nurse heard the commotion and rushed over to call the doctor. My baby was taken into the observation room. I stood outside the door, my legs weak, the back of my shirt soaked in sweat. The doctor came out a moment later, his tone stern. Premature babies are very sensitive. You must avoid any strong agitation. Prolonged crying can easily affect his breathing. Quote, be more careful next time. Tears streamed down my face as I listened. If something had happened to my son because of a moment of foolish fighting, I know I would never be able to forgive myself. My mother called Duck. Less than half an hour later, he appeared at the hospital. He hadn't even changed his shirt, his hair was messy from rushing, but his face was so cold it terrified me. He looked at me first to ask how the baby was. I told him the doctor was monitoring him and he was stable for now. He nodded and turned toward Thou. You say you care for him? Or do you just want to use him as a trophy to help your mother win? Thou was struck speechless. Mrs. Tham stood pressed against the wall, her hands trembling. She didn't dare look Duck in the eye. Perhaps she herself knew that this time, things had gone too far. Duck walked to the hospital reception desk to request the hallway camera footage. Thou panicked immediately. What are you planning to do? Are you going to turn your own sister over to the police for holding her nephew? Quote, Duck looked at her, his voice cold and sharp. No, I am providing evidence that you intentionally snatched a premature baby from the person caring for him. Mrs. Tham burst into tears, grabbing Duke's hand. Duck, don't make a scene, I beg you. Thou, she's just anxious and wanted me to see my grandson, that's all. Duck pulled his hand away and said slowly, I have been silent for too long. Silence hasn't made you realize anything. It only made you think my wife is easy to bully. From today on, if anyone touches my child without my and my wife's permission, I will show no more respect. That statement echoed through the hospital corridor. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to leave both Mrs. Tham and Thou stunned. I stood behind Duck, clutching my baby's blanket, my hands still trembling. I knew that from this moment on, the final bridge between my husband and me and his family had nearly been severed. It wasn't because we were cruel, but because they had repeatedly used family ties as an excuse to hurt my child and me. After the incident at the hospital, Duck no longer let things slide with just a few rushed apologies. Until now, he had always been the one trying to keep the peace. He had endured for his elderly mother, stayed silent to avoid adding pressure to me, and thought that standing in front of us was enough. But when he witnessed our newborn son crying until his face turned purple from being snatched away by his grandmother, I knew something inside him had finally broken. 2 days later, when our baby's health improved, Duck called his mother, Thou, and asked Uncle Fuck, a respected elder in the family, to join us. He asked them to come to my mother's house. He didn't invite many people, not wanting to turn this into a shouting match. He just wanted elders as witnesses, so that from now on, No one could say he had abandoned his mother for his wife. My mother initially didn't want to meet, but she eventually agreed. She said some things had to be cleared up once and for all, otherwise they would keep thinking her daughter was easy to bully. That afternoon, my mother's small living room felt so heavy I could barely breathe. I sat inside the room holding my child, but I could still hear every word outside. Mrs. Tham arrived first, her face looking far more haggard than in the days she stood in the yard shouting at me. Thou followed behind, lips pursed tight, her gaze still full of resentment, and Uncle Fuck sat in the middle chair, leaning on his cane with a stern face. He was the one who witnessed our wedding day and wished for me to live harmoniously at my husband's home. Perhaps he himself never imagined that years later he would have to sit here and hear about this mother-in-law and daughter-in-law conflict. Duck didn't beat around the bush. He placed 3 things on the table: discharge papers and my child's respiratory monitoring records, hospital security footage showing Thou harming the baby, and an old phone containing a recording file. Seeing the hospital papers, Mrs. Tham bowed her head, but when Duck played the old recording, her voice rang out clearly. If you give birth to a girl, just stay at your parents' house. It saves space in mine. The room went deathly silent. Sitting in the room myself, I felt my heart ache as if dragged back to the night I left my husband's house. Mrs. Tham burst into tears as soon as the recording ended. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her shoulders trembling, but Duck did not soften. He looked at his mother, his voice cold and low. Are you crying because you love your grandchild, or because you fear I will take this to the authorities? Mrs. Tham froze, her sobs caught in her throat. That question was cruel, but necessary, because if not asked directly, she would hide behind her tears again, just like so many times before. Thou immediately jumped up. Are you really going to sue your own mother? Are you still human? Mom just wanted to see her grandchild. She didn't kill anyone. Duck turned to his younger sister, his eyes no longer impulsively angry but terrifyingly calm. I'm not suing Mom. I'm protecting my wife and child from the very people called kin. And you, don't use the title of aunt to cover up the fact that you almost suffocated your own niece. Thou flushed red, intending to argue further, but Uncle Fuck tapped his cane hard on the floor and she sat back down. Just 2 words, and Thou fell silent instantly. He looked at Mrs. Tham, his aged voice firm and clear. Tham, what I've heard of this matter is absolutely outrageous. Now that I see the documents and hear the recordings, there is nothing left to defend. In the past, there were people in our family who favored boys over girls, but they were ignorant. But now, with my wife nearly in danger and the baby born prematurely, if our family still argues about who is right, we are finished. Mrs. Tham lowered her head, her hands clutching the edge of her shawl tightly. Duck took a breath and laid out each point clearly. From today on, Mrs. Tham and Thou are not to approach my child without my and my wife's permission. No showing up at the hospital, no blocking the gate, no harassing texts, and no calling relatives to pressure us. If it happens again, I will send all the evidence to the police and local authorities to file a report and protect my wife and child. Mrs. Tham turned pale the moment she heard the word police. Her voice trembled. Duck, I am your mother. If you do that, how can I face our relatives? Duck immediately replied, the day you drove Hong away in front of everyone, did you think about how she could face anyone? The day you let people call my wife an outsider, did you think about how much it hurt me? The room fell silent again. This time, even Thou couldn't say a word. After a long while, Mrs. Tham looked up, her voice much softer. Then what must I do for you to let me see my grandchild? The question no longer carried the tone of a command as it did before. It sounded like someone who had just realized the key was no longer in their hands. Duck looked at his mother for a long time and replied, 3 things. 1. You must apologize to Hong in front of both families. 2. You must apologize to my mother-in-law for insulting her family and treating them as a place to dump your daughter-in-law when you didn't need her. 3. You must tell the neighbors the truth yourself, that no one stole your grandchild, but that you drove Hong and the baby out of the house. Mrs. Tham sat there, stunned into silence. She had spent her whole life being respected, acting as the mother-in-law above her daughter-in-law. Asking her to bow her head was perhaps harder than making her lose money. She stammered, you want me to apologize to my daughter-in-law in front of everyone? Duck shook his head, you don't need to bow to Hong, you only need to bow to your own mistakes. It was then that my mother finally spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but every word was firm. I don't need you to kneel or put on a show for anyone. I just need you to remember that my daughter bore your grandchild. She isn't your servant. The day she came back here, pregnant and pale, dragging her suitcase. I didn't ask much, fearing she'd feel hurt, but as a mother, seeing my child kicked out of her husband's home. It hurts a lot, Mrs. Tham. Mrs. Tham burst into tears. This time, her weeping wasn't sharp or meant to pressure anyone. It was raspy and broken, like someone truly struck in their deepest core. Thou couldn't stand it anymore and jumped up. I'm not sitting here listening to this. Mother, you don't need to apologize to anyone. She said this and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. No one held Thou back. Mrs. Tham sat there for a long time, eventually whispering, barely audible, I was wrong. But I don't know where to start fixing it. Duck looked at his mother, his expression softening slightly but still remaining stern. He replied, start by not calling the baby a grandson, call it a child. A child needs love because they are flesh and blood, not because their gender pleases anyone. I sat in the room, hearing that, and tears fell onto my child's cheek. I don't know if I am ready to forgive yet. Perhaps not. But for the first time, I saw Duck protecting us not just with anger, but with a clear boundary. And for the first time, I heard Mrs. Tham say she was wrong without following it with any blame. A week after that tense conversation at my mother's, Mrs. Tham practically disappeared from phone calls and messages. She stopped calling to cry, stopped asking relatives to pass on words, and no longer stood outside my gate with bags of stuff. That silence initially made me guarded. After everything I've been through, I no longer easily trust any quietness coming from my husband's family. But then one afternoon, Duck received a call from Uncle Fuck. He said his mother had just asked the neighborhood leader to arrange a small meeting at the village cultural house. When Duck told me, I was changing my baby's diaper, and my hands froze for a long time. I asked, what does your mother want to do now? Duck looked at me, his eyes not entirely certain. He didn't know, but Uncle Fuck said she asked to speak in front of everyone herself. He thought I should witness it, not to forgive her right away, but to see if she would actually dare to face what she had done this time. I remained silent. To be honest, I didn't want to step into that place. That neighborhood had witnessed me being gossiped about, had heard all the claims that I was keeping the child, hiding him, and being unfilial. Now, asking me to return, my heart couldn't help but ache. Back when I first married into the family, I used to pass by that community hall during neighborhood meetings, holding a basket of fruit to help my mother-in-law offer to the neighbors. Back then, everyone praised me for being obedient, polite, and sensible. I used to think that as long as I lived righteously, people's gossip wouldn't make things difficult for me. Later on, I understood that lip service praise can change direction very quickly, especially when someone intentionally feeds it stories that are half true and half false. In the end, I still went with Duck but didn't bring our child along. He was still little and I didn't want him to continue being an object for adults to stare at. To judge, my mother stayed home to watch him. Before I left, she held my hand and told me to just stand tall. No need to fight for who's right or wrong. Let those who are wrong speak for themselves. Those words made me feel a little more steady. The neighborhood community hall wasn't too crowded that day, but everyone who had heard about my family's business was present. There was the group leader, Uncle Fuck, some elders from my husband's side, and the neighbors who usually sit out at the market. Mrs. Bailu was also there, sitting in the row by the window. Her face still wore that familiar look of confidence. Perhaps she thought Mrs. Tham called this meeting to get everyone to take her side or to continue blaming me for being an ungrateful daughter-in-law. But as I walked in, the first thing that made me freeze was Mrs. Tham's appearance. She stood at the front, in front of the old wooden table in the community hall, her hands clasped tightly together, her face looking much more haggard, her graying hair that was usually tied neatly now slightly messy at the nape of her neck. She wore no makeup, no gold necklace, and none of her usual stylish outfits. Looking at her then, I suddenly realized the woman who once terrified me was just a person weighed down by her own mistakes. The neighborhood leader cleared his throat, said a few opening words, and handed the floor to Mrs. Tham. The whole room went quiet. Mrs. Tham stood for a long time before looking up. Her voice was softer than usual but still clear enough. Today, I have come to admit my faults. Just that one sentence. The whole room started buzzing. I heard someone whispering, is Mrs. Tham really admitting her fault? Mrs. Bailu frowned, her expression shifting slightly. Mrs. Tham took a breath and continued, I used to favor men over women. I once thought a daughter-in-law had to bear a son to be a blessing to her husband's family. Because of that foolish thinking, I listened to outsiders, doubted my daughter-in-law, and sent her back to her parents while she was pregnant. Her voice trembled at the end of the sentence. I stood next to Duck, my hand clenching involuntarily. Those words couldn't erase my pain, but at least for the first time, she wasn't evading the truth. She looked at everyone and said each word clearly. It wasn't my daughter-in-law hiding my grandson. It wasn't her parents stealing him. I was the one who pushed them out of the house with my own hands. The room instantly fell silent. Some bowed their heads, others looked at me with eyes entirely different from before. I felt a lump in my throat. Because all this time, what I needed wasn't their pity, but for the truth to be put in its right place. Mrs. Bailu suddenly jumped up, her voice shrill, saying that is no different from blaming me. I never forced you to kick your daughter-in-law out. I was only offering advice about the house and the land. Everyone worries about that. Mrs. Tham turned to look at her. For the first time, her gaze was neither avoidant nor dependent. She said slowly, I was wrong to listen to you. But don't pretend you had nothing to do with it. You once told me that a daughter-in-law is, sooner or later, an outsider. You told me I had to protect my house. To keep the land, I had to be tough on her. I remember it all. Mrs. Bay flushed and hurriedly argued back. I was just joking. You're an adult. You make your own decisions. Mrs. Tham opened her old phone, her hands shaking but her presses still decisive. The recording echoed through the community hall. It was Mrs. Bailu's voice, as clear as day. The daughter-in-law had a girl. She'll just take the child back to her parents' place later. She doesn't care about her in-laws at all. I have to keep the house and the land starting now. The whole room erupted. Some shook their heads. Others looked at Mrs. Bay with contempt. Mrs. Bay opened her mouth several times but couldn't utter a complete sentence. Mrs. Tham turned off the phone and turned toward me. In that moment, I saw her eyes were red and watery. She didn't step closer, perhaps afraid of making me uncomfortable. She just stood where she was, head bowed. I'm not asking you to forget what I've done. I know a simple apology won't fix everything. I just ask that you give me a chance to make amends. If you can't forgive me yet, I understand. But I want everyone to know that you are not the disrespectful daughter-in-law they claimed. The one in the wrong was me. I stood still, my heart aching and in turmoil. Part of me wanted to cry, while another part remained guarded. Because old wounds don't heal just because the one who hurt you bows their head. Duck held my hand, not too tightly, and he didn't push me forward. He just stood by my side as a reminder that the choice remained mine. Then he looked at his mother and said, You did the right thing today, but forgiveness is Hong's right, not a debt you can demand. You admitted your mistake not to hold your grandchild immediately, but to start learning how to be a kind grandmother. Mrs. Tham bowed her head, tears falling onto the tiled floor. This time she didn't argue, nor did she bring up her own merits. The meeting ended with a heavy, yet clear atmosphere. As I walked out of the community hall, the looks directed at me had changed. They were no longer the prying eyes of people watching a daughter-in-law causing family strife, but the remorseful gazes of those who had listened to one side and judged too quickly. Mrs. Bailu quietly grabbed her bag and left, her face flushed red, not daring to look at anyone. Since that day, we haven't heard her loud voice preaching about other people's family business at the end of the alley anymore. As for Mrs. Tham, she stood for a long time under the hall's porch, her shadow stretching across the old concrete courtyard. I don't know if I have forgiven her yet, but I know that at least that day, she personally peeled away the pride she once valued more than family bonds. And for someone like Mrs. Tham, that was the truly first step on the path to making amends. After the public apology at the community center, Mrs. Tham no longer rushed to demand to see her grandchild like before. She also stopped calling incessantly, stopped asking relatives to pressure me, and stopped standing at the gate accusing me of being a heartless daughter-in-law. Everything slowed down gradually. At first, I still kept my distance. I was afraid that the change was only temporary, afraid that just as my heart softened, I would have to suffer another wound. But Mrs. Tham began to change through very small things. One day, Duck came home from work bringing a thermal container of black bone chicken porridge. He said his mother sent it, but she didn't tell me I had to eat it, nor did she ask if I was touched or not. Inside the bag was just a small note, her handwriting slightly shaky. I cooked it lightly. If you can eat it, then eat. If you can't, just toss it, don't feel bad. I finished reading, put the note on the table, and something in my heart eased. In the past, she used to hand me a bowl of soup as if she were doing me a favor, but now she is learning how to give without forcing others to receive. Once, Duck mentioned that she went to the ward health station herself to sign up for a newborn care tutorial. She sat among the young mothers, her hair more than half gray, holding a small notebook to write down everything. How to keep a premature baby warm, when not to hold them too much, and what signs of breathing difficulty look like. Hearing that, I said nothing, just quietly looked at my child sleeping. I still cannot forget what she did, but I also cannot deny that she is truly trying in the clumsy way of someone relearning things she once disregarded. One afternoon, an old neighbor met her at the market and laughed. "Mrs. Tham, you finally have a precious grandson." If it were in the past, she surely would have beamed with pride and boasted everywhere. But that time, she just softly corrected him, "Boy or girl, they are all my flesh and blood. As long as the child is healthy, I am happy." That remark was relayed back to my mother. My mother just sighed after hearing that. People who know how to change are worth another look, but whether to forgive or not is your choice. I understood she wasn't saying that to force me to soften my heart. She was just reminding me that life isn't always as black and white as we expect. Some people are wrong to the point of being unforgivable, but if they truly change, we also have the right to choose a lighter way to face it for our own peace. Not because they deserve it immediately, but because we ourselves need to live on without holding on to a heavy weight in our hearts forever. Then one day, while it was drizzling, I stood in the house looking out at the gate and saw Mrs. Tham. She didn't knock. She just adjusted her old hat, stood silently in the rain, placed a bag of items on the porch, and walked away. I hurriedly told Duck to go get it. In the bag were some soft towels, a bottle of cajeput oil, some newborn diapers, and a folded piece of paper. On it, she wrote that she was sending some things, not to make amends, but because she wanted to learn how to give to others without asking for anything back. I read that sentence for a long time. No tears fell, but my heart softened. It wasn't that the wound had healed, but that I started to see Mrs. Tham was no longer trying to insist she was right. She was standing at a distance, waiting for me to decide whether to let her step closer or not. That evening, Duck asked me, "Do you want to let Mom see the baby?" I looked at him, and he continued, "Take your time deciding. I won't let anyone pressure you again." Finally, I agreed, not because I forgot, and certainly not because I wanted everything to go back to how it was. I agreed because I felt my child shouldn't grow up amidst the resentment that adults refuse to let go of. But that meeting had to take place at my mother's house, with me, Duck, and my mother present. That was the boundary I needed to feel safe. The day Mrs. Tham arrived, she stepped in very quietly, no longer the overbearing mother-in-law who used to stand in the middle of the house ordering her daughter-in-law around. She just stood at the door, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the small cradle. When she saw my child sleeping, she burst into tears, but she didn't rush over, didn't ask to hold the baby, and didn't call her my grandchild like before. She just stood there, tears flowing down the wrinkles around her eyes. I picked up my baby and walked over to her. I said softly but clearly that she could hold him. But please remember, he is not a prize for anyone's victory or loss. He is not proof for anyone to boast about. He is just a child who needs to be loved the right way. Mrs. Tham tremblingly reached out to hold her grandson. The way she held him was clumsy and very careful, as if fearing that the slightest firm touch would hurt him. She looked down at my baby's tiny face and choked up. She apologized to him, and to me as well. Her tears fell onto the edge of his swaddle. She hurriedly wiped them away as if afraid of dirtying her grandson. Duck stood beside us with red eyes, but his voice remained stern. "I am giving you this chance not because you are his grandmother, but because you realize you were wrong. If you ever insult Hong again or use him to apply pressure, this chance will be gone." Mrs. Tham nodded repeatedly, not saying a word in protest. A few days later, Thou also came to apologize to me. Her apology was still awkward, and she wouldn't look me in the eye, but at least she wasn't as rude as before. I accepted her apology but made it clear that closeness cannot be restored immediately. There are doors that, once slammed shut, require time and genuine kindness to reopen. After that, my husband and I did not move back in with his family. Duck rented a small house near his workplace, enough for the three of us to start over. He still supports his mother, takes her to medical appointments, and fulfills his duty as a son. But he set clear boundaries that no one is allowed to insult his wife and child ever again. Mrs. Tham did not object. Perhaps she understood that for family ties to last, there must be respect, not just blood. When my son turned 3 months old, Mrs. Tham came to visit again. This time when she held him, she didn't brag about having a grandson, didn't mention the firstborn son, and didn't talk about family lineage. She just sat by the window swaying gently, watching him sleep soundly in her arms. A long while later, she softly said, "As long as you are healthy, Grandma loves you." I stood nearby hearing that, and my heart felt strangely at peace. Perhaps forgiveness is not forgetting all the pain. Forgiveness is sometimes just giving each other a chance to live better, within the boundaries that were preserved with tears.